Okay, students, so I want to introduce paper number one. Paper number one is a rhetorical analysis. And as you see here in the green box up here, you'll see the minimum requirements for paper number one. So the minimum requirements here are, as stated, it should be at least a 1,200 word document, MLA documentation. So this includes the way the paper looks. So it should have the proper MLA heading. It should have a title. It should have 1 inch margins. It should be double spaced. It should have the correct citation method. So you'll need a works cited page that at least includes your documentary, as well as any outside sources that you use. If you do any direct quotation or paraphrasing, you'll need to use in-text citation, okay? If you're not familiar with a works cited page or in-text citation, you'll have to look those up on your own at this point. We'll be dealing with that for assignment number 2 pretty extensively. This is worth 20% of your grade. So it's a pretty substantial amount of your grade. However, we will be going through rough draft. You'll get feedback on that, and then you'll be able to revise that rough draft as you get feedback from myself and your peers. So the basic idea here is that you will pick a documentary and you will perform a rhetorical analysis on this documentary. So just to kind of read through the description and go through it with you, the description for this assignment is as follows. Documentary film is probably one of the first mediums to come to mind when we think about documenting reality. Yet they are also one of the most complex formats for recording aspects of our world. Documentary films use a variety of methods, including images, words, sounds, and various film techniques to present an argument. So documentary film, to me, represents complex rhetoric, right? There's a filmmaker who is trying to make a statement and reach an audience, and they are doing that through their documentary. Now, people who aren't really familiar with documentary get really kind of enthralled by it, seeing documentary as completely and utterly representing the truth. However, I like to, especially in this assignment, we're seeing documentary as using rhetorical appeals to forward a director, a filmmaker's argument, okay? So, for example, they'll use, documentary films often use interviews, they'll use dramatizations, they'll use, testimonials, statistics, facts, things like that to help present their argument. Now, it's not that the documentary is being untruthful. It is, however, that they are definitely capitalizing on their use of rhetoric, okay? So, and I'm looking at the second paragraph of the description here. This project asks you to view a documentary film and to analyze the rhetorical strategies employed by the filmmaker in the construction of the film argument. So you'll look at all of these different things in the Paper 1 folder to help you kind of understand rhetorical appeals, as well as reading the chapters that I assign in our book, as well as participating in the discussions that I hope are leading you towards thinking about these different rhetorical appeals. And in this paper, so now I'm looking at the part in the bold here in the orange, you will be asked to recognize and evaluate the film's appeals to pathos, logos, and ethos. So those are the 3 main rhetorical appeals that we're talking about. And I want you to measure those against the rhetorical situation. So the rhetorical situation, and again, there's a Prezi on this in the Paper 1 folder. The rhetorical situation is the context of any argument. So these documentaries weren't created in a vacuum. They were created for a reason. they were created. Maybe the filmmaker had a personal agenda. Maybe the reason is the filmmaker's personal agenda kind of aligned with social and cultural critique happening. So, for example, the documentary Blackfish the context behind that being the filmmaker has a personal connection, but also kind of a heightened critique of, the animal entertainment industry in the media. In order to, so you see hint, you'll have to do some basic research to help you construct the rhetorical situation of your documentary. But basically, one of the things that you'll want to establish up front in your paper is what is the rhetorical situation. So the rhetorical situation also isn't apparent by just watching the documentary. You'll have to understand things like, why was the documentary created? What kind of issue is this responding to? What kind of audience is meant for this documentary? I know that you'll want to say that it's just the general public, like that people need to know about this. But sometimes by digging a little deeper, you'll see that the filmmaker has tried to target a specific audience, even though the general public is also included in that. And the job here is to measure these rhetorical appeals against the rhetorical situation, to evaluate how well the director used these rhetorical appeals to really kind of capitalize on making their argument. So, for example, we'll take pathos, for example, right? You might say the rhetorical situation is bringing awareness to the folks. Part of the rhetorical situation is that your documentary looks at, a hostile audience on this topic and tries to persuade that audience to believing their argument. So you're going to want to look at appeals to pathos and see if the appeals to pathos are in line with appealing to a hostile audience. Is there too much emotion here, right? Maybe a hostile audience really needs logos. Maybe they really need statistics and facts. Maybe in terms of logos, a hostile audience needs to be kind of weaned into this argument. So the structure needs to be more gradual, but maybe the director kind of starts off really strong. And again, your job is to both identify these appeals. So, hey, this is an appeal to pathos. Analyze and talk about how these appeals are working, and then finally evaluate their effectiveness. One of the things that I want to caution you here is you'll be tempted to respond to the film's argument. So you'll be tempted to say, in Blackfish, I really believe that the director was correct. That's not the job of this paper at all. The job of this paper is to really kind of pick apart what the director did with rhetorical appeals, how they're using interviews, how they're using testimonials, how they're using images and sounds and words and film techniques to kind of help forward their argument. Okay? So again, like I said, the skills that we're bringing to this paper are rhetorical appeals and rhetorical analysis. And that's what we're working towards in this unit. And your job is to use those skills and apply them to analyzing the documentary that you choose. So I've listed the documentaries below that you can choose. You can also decide to veer from this list. You don't have to let me know what documentary you pick. However, if you want to pick something that's not on this list, shoot me a quick email and say, hey, I looked at this documentary. Can I write on this? 90% of the time I'm going to say yes, but there's a couple of documentaries that I just don't think help rhetorical analysis or really kind of are really good for rhetorical analysis. So I might say no, but most of the time I'm probably going to say yes. I also want to caution you, if you've never watched a documentary before, documentaries try to hit home on a topic. They are, I wouldn't say they're shocking, but they oftentimes, especially some of these social and political commentary documentaries, oftentimes they take a subject that we all are familiar with, and I wouldn't say they ruin it for us, but they open it up to investigation in a way that, maybe you don't want to think about or you're not used to thinking about. So, for example, I've often showed in previous classes Food Inc. or The Cove. In the classes, Food Inc. looks at food production and factory farming, and, spoiler alert, it's kind of gross and disgusting. And I've had students get really worked up at me for showing them this documentary. The same thing with The Cove. The Cove is about dolphin slaughtering. Again, really emotional, kind of not something we're used to thinking about every day. Definitely a sensitive topic. So I encourage you to look up what these documentaries are about before viewing them to make sure that you're willing to quote unquote go there with these topics. Blackfish is about SeaWorld. If you love SeaWorld and you don't want SeaWorld ruined for you, or you don't want to have to think about that critically, then pick a different one. Pick a different documentary. There's a lot of documentaries here. I just don't want you all as students to get into something that you don't want to get into, and I want you to make informed choices. I don't think any of these documentaries make arguments that are far from something that you could figure out on your own. However, again, I've had students get really upset with me for ruining, like, for example, Food Inc. might ruin McDonald's for you. And I've had students get really upset with me for showing them or exposing them to that. So you have your pick as to what documentary you want to watch. But like I said, inform yourself about these documentaries. In terms of specifics here, I think this is a really good rundown of the type of things that I want in this paper. So pretty specific. I want you to have a thesis. This is an argumentative essay. You're arguing that your evaluation on the rhetorical appeal, on the way these rhetorical appeals operate within the documentary, that you're arguing that your evaluation is correct. And so the thesis opens up your paper and says, hey, I evaluate the author has really strong appeals to ethos and pathos, but lacks appropriate appeals to logos, right? So that's your thesis. That's going to guide your paper, and that's what's going to, hopefully you're going to illustrate throughout your body paragraphs. But it still needs to be there. So without a thesis, I don't know what you're going for. And in terms of where to place your thesis, this isn't a very surprising paper. You're not trying to shock anyone. I would definitely place your thesis in the introduction, pretty standard stuff here. You'll also want to give us an overview of the rhetorical situation, okay? So you'll need to research this a little bit. The rhetorical situation serves as a basis for your analysis and evaluation. So once you understand the context of the documentary, you'll be able to better analyze its rhetorical appeals. Remember, I said that rhetoric doesn't exist in a vacuum. So again, if you've established that the audience here, maybe you've established that for Blackfish, the audience is animal lovers, people who are sympathetic to the plight of animals, right? You've decided that. That means that, as you're analyzing pathos and how the director is using emotion to kind of capture the hearts of the audience, it would be different if they were trying to capture, say, a businessman or CEOs of the company. So keep that in mind. So that's part of the rhetorical situation. So I would suggest adding a paragraph that kind of gives the overview of the rhetorical situation, talking about what the documentary is, why it was created, who it was created for, and what kind of stake the filmmaker has in making this documentary. Is this something that comes from their passionate heart, or is this something Are they part of this community? Are they not part of this community, etc.? The body paragraphs should do the following. They should identify, analyze, and evaluate appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos. Okay, so your body paragraphs help you support your thesis and build your claim. Say you're writing a paragraph on pathos, appeals to pathos. You're going to want to pull out a couple of examples from the documentary. Identify these. Say these are how the director uses pathos. They use pathos, say, with interviews, right? Maybe you say that. You're going to analyze that. You're going to explain how these interviews work and operate as pathos and what they do. What's their function in creating emotion? And how do they create emotion? And then you're going to evaluate these. Do you think that these interviews create the appropriate amount of emotion? Do they create too much emotion? How do they work with forwarding the argument? How do they work with connecting to the audience, right? So think about that. And again, I just went over pathos, but you're going to do the same thing for ethos and logos, okay? Now, the other thing is that, again, as an argumentative essay, the argument is, hey, audience, see things the way that I see them. This is my evaluation, and I'm going to prove it this way. Your body paragraphs, where you identify, evaluate, and analyze these different appeals, should be built through evidence, analysis, and evaluation, not just summary. So that's where I think a lot of students struggle with this paper, is that they stop at summarizing the film, and they don't go far enough to both analyze and evaluate these different appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos. I also tell students here, think beyond just the argument presented, okay? Think through how the author uses visuals, evidence, music, storytelling, etc., to rhetorically get their message heard. So you don't just have to say, this is the argument, right? Pathos is created through some of the visuals, some of the music. Maybe they've created this really enthralling narrative that is part of pathos. Think of ethos. The director's building credibility, right? Maybe some of the interviews they use are helping with that. Maybe the director tells their own story in here. Maybe the director has credibility as a director of other things. In terms of logos, right? Logos isn't logic. It's a logic that someone's building, right? So it's a lot of ways evidence and structure. So think about the way that the entire documentary is structured. Think about the different types of evidence used. Is the director just using statistics and facts, or are they using interviews? Are they using testimonials? How does that as evidence help build and get the audience to think through this issue with their brains? Whereas pathos gets them to think through it with their hearts. So again, these are the different types of, claims that you can build. So you will be evaluated. This is how I'm grading this piece, is I'm looking at, your ability to identify, evaluate, and analyze the filmmaker's use of ethos, pathos, and logos in respect to the rhetorical situation. You'll also be graded on your ability to see the larger picture, how the film's strategies of persuasion align with its argument. Okay? Now, if you want to get a better look at, the kind of method I use for grading, there's the exact grading rubric that I use is listed under Paper 1 folder, okay? And use everything in the Paper 1 folder as a resource. Obviously, you should definitely take a look at it once, because it's part of helping you understand these rhetorical appeals. So some of the PowerPoints I go through and some of the prezzies that are just listed there, those are things that you should look at definitely once, just to understand some of these things, and also reading the information provided in the textbook. But keep these as resources as you're writing your paper. There's also sample papers put up there. So use those, not to mime by any means, but to but to think through as good examples of what I'm asking you to do in this paper, okay? All right, so I'm definitely looking forward to reading this paper.